Well, let's take this away then. Hello everyone tuning in. This is episode of podcast, and we're here with Nicole. And we're gonna now allow Nicole to introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Cameron. So my name is Nicole Canzoneri. I'm 22 years old. Currently, I'm a student at the University of Windsor. I'm studying disability studies. I have a minor in political science. And since I was like 15, I've been a part of Reaction for Inclusion and Community Living Ontario movements. And I've gotten to do so many amazing things and had so many amazing experiences over the years. So I'm super happy to be able to talk about some of them today.
Just to expand a bit, you said you had a minor in political science there. How are you liking that?
I quite enjoy it. I quite enjoy it. It works well with my degree in disability studies. That degree focuses a lot on the policy and culture and community of disability. So it pairs really nicely, and I find there's a lot of parallels.
And that really pairs well today with today's topic, institutionalization. So you've done a project on this already, and I'm quite familiar with this project, but for our audience, could you please just I'm going to give you the open floor, discuss your project.
Yeah, thank you. So the project's called The Truths of Institutionalization, the Past and Present. And it is an online educational curriculum to teach about institutionalization in Ontario or in Canada. And we've gotten to do a ton of really cool things. And COVID, when it first hit, kind of stifled some of the traveling and stuff like that. So a lot of it turned to online, but it has interviews with survivors of institutions, experts in the field, people who have worked there, who saw the closure of institutions. It has video segments and reading segments, image segments, and it's for students in high school, but it's also for anyone. Anyone can get stuff from it. But for students, there's a workbook that the teachers can use to actually teach it in a classroom setting. So it has a ton of value, not just from one person going through it on their own, but also in that classroom setting. But it has a lot of different media sources to teach about something that isn't always taught about. And I got to be the host for the video portion of it and a youth advisor for some of the content that is in it to help make sure it was relevant to youth and that the most was going to be get out of the information that we had. So yeah, I got to help out with that, and it was pretty awesome.
So as you know, I did a chemistry bonus project on this, tying it into a drug. So something I found is a lot of people don't know what institutionalization means. So kind of to go a few steps back, could you explain to people what institutionalization is exactly? Like how can it really be defined?
Yeah, so I wouldn't take my word for it too much, but my understanding is that institutionalization specifically refers to the mass housing and storing, for lack of a better term, of people typically with some form of disability that happened in Ontario, and that was or in Canada, sorry. And that was the main way to support, again, for lack of a better term, people who didn't meet society standards. But what happened across the world actually was some people who didn't even meet the set requirements to go into institutions were placed there. So if you were just a disruptive child, sometimes you were put in an institution. If you had psychiatric disabilities, you were put in institutions aimed or defined to support people with intellectual disabilities. And what it turned into was very similar to what we see with the history of residential schools in Canada. And it was just not only traumatizing for the people who were there, but a very dark spot in Canadian history that isn't over. So when we talk about it, sometimes I use the word was and past tense, but that's because I live in Ontario and institutions are closed in Ontario and have been for most of my life now. But in some provinces, they are not. And in some other places around the world, they are not. So when I say past tense, it's personally just from an Ontario perspective.
I want to bring up something just because I did mention I did do my chemistry project. I'm not trying to detract here, but I'm trying to add on to it. So I actually, for bonus video project, had to do a story about a chemical. And so when I was looking, I was like, okay, what could I do my topic on? And then I look and I see institutionalizations, and I'm like, this is perfect because drugs here were used as a control in institutions. And I ended up doing my project on benzodiazepines. And what I found through my scholarly research was actually like disturbing. Very, very disturbing. So, in layman's terms, benzodiazepines work on the central nervous system, and they are just so strong because of some of these properties. And this made them an excellent control for these institutions. So it was just interesting to me. And sort of like when you learn this information, you might have known this beforehand. But what do you think of this? Like, what do you think that such a drug has such a big impact?
Yeah, one of the things I got to learn was specifically, I think the term was used was medical restraint. So we think of restraint sometimes as the physical holding of someone, but when you use it medically, you mean the same kind of drugs that exactly, Cameron, you're talking about. And like you said, they currently can be used in a controlled setting to alleviate people of some anxieties and let them participate meaningfully in life. But when you use them in a way that is to restrain someone, to stop certain behaviors from occurring, to make them more easy to handle, because there was so many people in institution with such a small amount of staff, um, it's abuse, and it's terrifying. And like you said, these withdrawals are so extreme, but so are the long-term effects, like on your health overall. Even if you just never stop them, it's damaging to a lot of parts of your bodies. And that was a lot of what I got to learn when I was meeting with these survivors who are much older, who have been on these medications and gone through these types of restraints for such a long portion of their developmental life. Because remember, institutions originally were for people who were children, under 18 typically, and a lot of times they were um, advertised as educational facilities. And that evolved over time to become more just a living facility. But originally, that's how they were defined. And so when people at that young age are on those kind of medications, it can be so detrimental to your health. So when I hear about like your project is so amazingly interesting, and I think it can highlight too how easy it is today to abuse the same kind of thing. Like Xanax, you mentioned, I know for a lot of people that's used as like an emergency medication. So if you're having a panic attack or if you're having a heightened experience, it can be used to bring you down in the moment, calm you down. Think of just how easy that is to abuse if you are someone administering it to someone else, how your own mindsets, how your own ways of thinking and experiences could cause you to use it too much when supporting someone else, and it's not you, so you don't know exactly how they're feeling on it and that kind of stuff. So it can do a lot of wonderful things for a lot of people, but one thing I learned is just how careful we have to be with repeating the same usage, um, or same patterns of usage for some of these medications and treatments.
We think of these sciences as like being separate and pure, but in reality, some of these sciences are a direct cause of this. Like the advancement in chemistry to have these nice reactions that work so well can lead to devastating chemicals such as this. Um, and so I remember in another class I took this semester, I we had a difficult conversation about being responsible for what we make, being responsible for any waste that we do as well. Like chemists taking responsibility. Because like when we're doing our research papers, we have to stay unbiased. We have to, detract ourselves from the paper that we make. But at the same time, that removes our responsibility. It's like, oh, we just made this compound. We didn't know what it would do. That's not our problem. That's the person who used its problem. or the person who exploited's problem. Um, so it's sort of like, well, how can we now take ownership of this? Like, uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and
wh-
for my program in school, we take a lot of we take disability studies courses, but we also take a lot of psychology courses to help fill us in on that kind of understanding of disability. And one thing I've personally struggled with is just how different they view disability. And my professors note this from the first day in my disability core classes. Like, you're going to take some classes that are going to differ in views from some things that we learn in these classes. And they don't directly contradict one another, but they take different guiding viewpoints. And one thing that I found in my psychology classes was just how, like how you say, be responsible with the chemicals, also being responsible with the non-chemical treatments, like the therapies and that kind of stuff discussed in psychology. Turns out years later, there's people in my disability studies class that we're looking at who say, no, this way of treatment traumatized me, or here's all the adverse long-term effects that I felt from this common practice empirically studied in psychology. So I think it's so important to like have that understanding from a different lens of, okay, in the chemistry field, for example, this works this way and we've created this wonderful thing. How ethically might it be applied? What responsibilities do we have that way? And I think there's a lot of parallels with psychology in that manner too.
yeah, no, like, definitely in chemistry, there's a lot of ethical questions, and realistically, from what I've seen, a lot of chemists avoid those ethical questions because they're just like, well, let's just make this random drug or this random chemical, and then let's see what it does. Let's just, like, that's how it used to be. It's like, oh, we're making discoveries. Let's just do it.
Something you said there kind of sticks with me again, bringing it back to like the psychology realm and institutionalization realm is, as we learn more, like we can do better. And you're talking about with chemistry, but it's the same in psychology. Like, now there's some of the most foundational theories were based on super unethical experiments, and like the Stanford prison experiment, like the Alfred baby experiment, all these things. And so now you're not allowed to do them anymore. Like, you can never replicate stuff like that because they were so traumatizing and unethical. And one thing we highlight in my classes, like one thing we learned about the Michener Institute in Alberta, which was a massive, large-scale institution. And one thing we highlight is that, like, as we learn more, we do better. So when we study these institutions and their impact, when we study these psychological studies and their impact, when we study chemistry and the impact, we can take these like failures as learning points. And that's what I think is super important with institutionalization. Like, okay, we're hearing from a ton of people that this wasn't that good. No matter what you thought as an expert in psychology or an expert at the time in disabilities, this did not have the outcome you wanted. It caused so much massive harm. And there's studies showing that there's better ways to do things. And I think that is so important to take from the experiences, the lived experiences of people who were in these institutions. And so I think it's interesting, those parallels in like every field and every experience.
I kind of want to tie it back in, like, because I know chemistry is an institution, so I kind of want to tie it back in another case study, sort of related, but like a bit different. Have you heard of the thalidomide disaster?
I believe so. Is that when it was given for a short period of time and people were born without certain limbs?
Absolutely, birth
Yeah.
defects, and that actually has to do with chiral chemistry. And so chemists were like, we can make this lovely drug that can be used for morning sickness in pregnant women. But they didn't take into account that it was a chiral compound where you make the other half that causes birth defects. Massive, massive birth defects. Like, there's this woman who denied thalidomide because she saw the evidence that could be potential, and she got a lot of flack for that.
Yeah, and like you talk about someone who resisted taking that. That's like the exact same thing with institutions. There's some very powerful people who we got to hear from who refused to send their child, even though it was best practice at the time. And oh, the doctor said, here's an easy, like here's something you can do in it, and it can help make your lifestyle more comfortable or fit the societal norms and expectations at the time. And even though these experts were saying it's the best thing, like yeah, it's best for your child, we know now that it just wasn't. It just wasn't. And so it's exactly parallel to like um not everything that is said professionally as best practice ends up being best practice when you see the real life outcomes of it.
Absolutely. And just to wrap up my point there, it's like it ties back to how chemists need to be ethical. It's, that happened, and it's like the chemists were like, we did this. They didn't really take ownership. In fact, they were like, let's distance ourselves from this. I mean, they teach it now in my classes. It's like a case study of what not to do. But the ones who were involved at the time just stepped back and were like, yeah, we're not going to be associated with that. Like they tried to fix it, but at the same time, it was like, yeah, it's not our fault.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And again, I think there's so many parallels about what happened in institutions. And I think for high school students, like we don't get to learn about this stuff. Like no matter, maybe if you take chemistry in high school, you get to hear about that. Maybe if you take social studies in high school, you get to hear about institutions. But I think like on the topic of the project, like I think it's a really cool way to help fill those
Mhm.
gaps and help ensure that these like really impactful lessons that are like we know in history now are taught from a young age and can help change people's mindsets about things.
So, speaking on the curriculum, how do you think it'll change the view of inclusion in classrooms if we continue teaching about institutions?
Yeah, I think it puts into perspective why we need to care about inclusion and how an absolute disregard for inclusion, how dangerous it is and what it can lead to. And I know it's common practice today in a lot of ways for people to talk about inclusion and to know what it is, but sometimes people with disabilities are left out of that conversation. But also sometimes it just becomes so common practice that we don't maybe realize just how important it is and how valuable it is. And I think highlighting how this kind of ignoring inclusion and not caring about it and practices that came from it, like institutions, like we have this proof that when you ignore inclusion and when you segregate and isolate large populations, how traumatizing it is. And I think this curriculum can really help highlight the value of it and also the risk with not valuing it.
So you mentioned specifically, I believe earlier, that people back then didn't trust the experts on this. They were like, yeah, this isn't good. This isn't really great for my child.
Like there was this really amazing woman that we interviewed, and her mind escapes me right now, but she absolutely refused to send her son to the institution. And she was left with no resources like in the community. And so I think understanding that it was kind of all or nothing. Either you accepted this very harmful practice to support your child with a disability, or you got nothing.
Yeah, to get back to your curriculum a bit there, what do you want people to take away from it?
I have kind of a pessimistic and an optimistic view of what I want people to take away. So like on the pessimistic side, I want people to understand that like we're not out of the waters. Like I had mentioned earlier, this isn't long time history ago. This happened in my lifetime. Like I'm 22, this happened in my lifetime and is continuing to happen. Like there's still a lot of, or there's, I think, two provinces that still have large scale institutions. And even if we don't have these large scale ones, we have some congregate living settings that really resemble a lot of the things we saw with institutionalization and the mindsets that drove them. So one thing I want people to take away is that we're not done. Like, this isn't a long time ago, and this isn't something we can just learn about now. This is something we're still living, and many people with disabilities, not only in Canada but around the world, are still being traumatized through and experiencing. And then on a way more positive note, this project just showed how much support there is within this deinstitutionalization community and movement, and how powerful it is, and how powerful the people are who have fought this battle their whole life, like who have fought this battle 10 times longer than I've, not 10 times, 3 times longer than I've been alive. Like, it was so, I want people to take away that you're not alone. If you think that this isn't right, there is thousands of people who agree with you. And this curriculum and filming it was a really awesome way for me to see that, oh, this isn't just a few people. This is large scale movements and communities that just realize that this isn't the best practice. This isn't what we should be doing. And I want people to take away the motivation from it, and how inspiring it is to see a lot of these people. And even though some parts of the curriculum are heavy and it's hard, and you feel pessimistic, and you feel like, how are we ever going to change? I think there's some really wonderful modules that highlight, wow, change is happening, has happened, and is going to continue to happen. So though it might be seem pretty low energy and upsetting at certain points, maybe even for some people in the curriculum, when you watch or go through a lot of the stuff later in the modules, it's like, oh wow, but look at what we've done, and look at what we are doing, and what we're going to continue to do.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I had to look through some of the modules for my project. I will say, like, they are inspiring. They definitely show a negative part of history, but they also, at least to me, show some optimism, some hope for the future. Um, so just to tie it into Yak, what do you think Yak can do to help with this project?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to, when you're comfortable, go through some of the material at your own pace, whether that's all of it, whether it's just a tiny bit. And don't just go through the sad parts, maybe go through the happy parts too, and the motivational and the inspiring parts. I think it's important to find a way to educate yourself, whether that's you doing it, whether that's someone doing it and relaying some of the information to you, whether that's going through it with someone. I think it's important to understand why this is such an important movement, and why we should be raising awareness. And like you said, some of it's inspiring. So I think it's important to get that inspiration. Um, I also think we can reflect. And that's another step to raising awareness, reflecting on what we see in our lives and in our schools and in our workplaces, and how that's similar, how it's different, and highlighting again, like how it's not completely over. And then to raise awareness as a whole for the curriculum, I think it's important just to talk to people, like I had a really awesome friend of my mom's who's a principal now. And I went to her and I said, hey, there's something really cool here. I know you're someone who cares about social justice. I see it in your day-to-day practice as an educator and as a principal, the values you have. Here's a resource that aligns with all the things that you've taught me and all the values I've seen from you. So what I found helpful is looking at people in my life who I see as equity leaders, as inclusion leaders, whether it be in their own small community, their household, whatever setting, and going to them and showing them what we have here. And even if it's just for their own education, that's one more person who saw it and who has that knowledge. Or if it's a classroom or a school setting or anything like that, I think going to people who have those similar mindsets, or who you think might have them, is a really safe way to first start spreading awareness for it, and then joining movements and joining large scale discussions when you're comfortable. There's tons of online options. Like, I know if you're not someone who wants to talk and meet with people, there's forums where you're just typing and reading. If you're someone who loves social stuff and getting together, like Reaction for Inclusion, we're together on video calls. That's a more social way to join something that raises awareness for this kind of topic. I know the deinstitutionalization task force has a newsletter. Like there's some really awesome different ways to get involved with this curriculum, with this movement as a whole. And that doesn't have to be massive, large scale change. It can just be sitting in on a group call with other groups who are like-minded, or it can be going through the whole curriculum yourself. Like there's so many different options, but I think going through the material is important to understand and to be inspired yourself, and also reflecting on it before you bring it forward to anyone, and just understanding how institutionalization exists or has existed in your own life and communities and that kind of stuff.
That's a lot to take for sure. I kind of want to connect it to next week's topic, because next week's topic is going to be on Indigenous people, and I think something that could be drawn from that is residential schools. So I know they're not exactly the same thing, but sorry, do you see any parallels between institutions and residential schools?
Yeah, so that was literally my first topic or first conversation when we were creating this curriculum. We were looking through, like, it was before we even had the modules organized. They're like, hey, it was just a super casual meeting. Hey, what do you think? And I go, oh my gosh, this is how we're taught about residential schools. And I was 19 at the time, so I was a few years out of it, but in grade 10, that was when I first started to learn about residential schools. In grade 11 and 12, I took some Indigenous studies classes in high school, and I was like, guys, this is the parallel. This is one, a way we're already comfortable discussing stuff in schools, but also two, a lot of common and shared experiences there that are important to highlight for people who maybe don't fully understand just exactly the large scale impact of institutionalization. So I think there's a ton of parallels within how they're run, but also within the mindsets that fueled them. That segregation mindset, that isolation mindset, the ways of thinking about how people thought about and valued people who are Indigenous or people with disabilities. I think there's so many parallels. And there was actually a young man, or a man in one of the modules, again, his name escapes me now, but who we talked about, who was Indigenous and also had an intellectual disability and was put in a institution, not a residential school, just because of what was common practice for both populations at the time in Canada. And he reflected on his experience of not being able to celebrate some of his Indigenous culture, but in the institution setting. So there was that parallel. I'm glad you saw it too, because it's touched upon in some of the resources, but I think it's a really important way that we can understand just the large scale impact of institutions. So that was literally my first thought when we first started talking about brainstorming for this project. I was like, whoa, guys, like this is something that has a lot of potential here to help highlight the atrocities.
So I know some would say it sort of has the danger of detracting from residential schools, and has the danger of really taking away the impact of residential schools and allocating it to something else. Like, sort of like saying, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, an Indigenous person could look at this and see it as someone who isn't us complaining about something that they don't really understand.
Absolutely, it could.
So my question there is, how do you respond to that? How do you really deal with that in a respectful manner?
Absolutely. So I'm not an Indigenous person, so I can't say what that experience was like and that intergenerational experience. But what we can highlight in a respectful manner is these are very different still, but what fueled them, the mindsets at the very core, that people who are Indigenous or people who are disabled were not valued by white, neurotypical, able-bodied society. at the time in their communities. And I think in a respectful way, we can highlight the large scale general ways of thinking without taking away from the uniqueness and individual experiences of both people who are in residential schools and people who are in institutions. So I think it is important to highlight they're not the same. They're not, but the ways of thinking is a pattern.
And do you think that pattern then goes back, like, how far? How far does that go back?
You know, I don't know. I don't know how far back, but one thing I've with my courses and with this work was highlighting was how far forward they still are to current day. And when we look at some large scale congregate living settings and stuff like that, that's where my expertise comes in a little bit about how these mindsets are still in a different form, maybe to a different degree, practiced in the same communities and societies that say we've learned from some of the past atrocities we've committed. So I don't know how far back. I don't. I don't know enough about human nature and history to understand that, but I know they're definitely not gone.
All right, then expand on how far forward this will go.
Yeah, well, so my hope is with this kind of material being created and more widespread, it will come to an end. I know there's been a lot of movement even for nursing homes that we saw during COVID-19. It really highlighted how dangerous those kind of living situations are for super large scale, and how not only can there be health impacts, but the social and emotional impacts for people who are living in these settings was heightened. So for people who were in group homes, they had different restrictions even than everyone else who was not living in these homes, because they also had the restrictions of an organization or of their supervisors or their managers who were in control of a lot of aspects of their lives. So I think until we highlight how these how this control is still happening, it's going to keep happening. But I think material like this is a really, really unique way and powerful way to highlight it, or to bring this kind of thinking to the younger generations. I was very lucky. I got to learn about this at a young age. And like I said, I was 19 when I started doing this project. So that's pretty young to be able to understand or begin to understand a lot of these things. So I think by making it so youth friendly, this is a really powerful way for the practice of isolation and segregation for people with disabilities to eventually go away. I know it's not forever, and I know there's a lot of work we have to do, but I think this is a really powerful tool to help move that work forward.
There's actually a scientific argument that will never remove any type of discrimination, because the brains are hardwired to see anything different as bad, naturally, and that's a natural process. So if that's the case, assuming that's the case, and we can't completely eliminate it, are you still optimistic that we can at least, put it to rest, that it's not widely accepted, that it's not like, it's not something that impacts on a wide scale like institutions did? Like, we can move past it, we can ensure it doesn't happen again, and accept that it's a part of nature. It won't completely go away. Like, it won't be an absolute zero, but we can at least, use checks and balances to make sure it stays under control.
Yeah, and I know there's a ton of different theories in psychology about human nature and all that stuff. And if it is so part of our human nature, I think it's we can't we can't change exactly our initial reaction to things. Sometimes we're scared of things we don't know about, but I think what we can change is our reaction to the initial reaction. So if I notice, oh, I'm scared of this thing, I can learn to then go, why? Why am I scared? What's so fearful? Is it because it's actually something I should be scared of? Or is it because it's something different and something I don't have experience with? And then from there, we can go on to say, okay, how can I help to make sure that, one, this reaction isn't harming other people? And one way is by not implementing those kind of reactions into large scale policy and structures. But two, also, how do I educate myself to realize that this reaction isn't an educated one? If it comes from human nature, that whatever's triggering that doesn't know what we know now and doesn't know what I have learned. So I think it's reacting to the initial reaction.
I think that's all the time we have. It was a great conversation, but I think we have to wrap this up. So I want to thank you for being on this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. As always, I love chatting with you, and it's such an important project. And anyone who can take time to look through some of it, share it with people you know. And thank you for taking the time to help share this project.
No problem. Thanks everyone for tuning in. See you next time.